Welcome to Getting to Know You. This has been an idea of Betty Ozan's in that our community is a close and closed community, but many people, if not all of the people, have done many interesting things in their lives. And we have invited people to please share your stories so that we can know the many different lives you've lived that aren't just Westminster, because Westminster is a wonderful place to be, but we also would like to know more about you. And this gives us a time to, I guess nowadays, go into your living room and have a conversation. And
sounds good.
we have this flyer that is out, that if people would be willing to volunteer, which we really appreciate, put your name and number down, and I will call you when we organize another round of these. In the meantime, I have Mari here, and Mari has a very interesting story, including her name. So I will let you introduce your name.
Okay, well, I chose back in 1980 the name Mariamne Paulus because I had been working for several years to change patterns in my given personality, and the Diane name never fit me anymore. People could call me Diane and I wouldn't notice that they were meaning me. And so my inner voice said, take a new name. And I searched through all the English names I knew, all the Spanish names I knew, finally went to Hebrew names and came upon Mariamne, and it resonated my heart. So I chose the name without thinking of the fact that people would not be able to say it, remember it, spell it, use it at all. So when we moved here to Westminster Village, I decided I would just tell people my name is Mari, which is the short of Mariamne, easier for people to say and remember, and it's been working pretty well.
But it's a beautiful name.
It is a beautiful name,
yes.
and I love it, and it really rings the bell of my heart when someone calls me Mariamne and even Mari.
Mm-hmm. Well, in reading some of your story, you and I have followed territories in an interesting way. Because for 12 years, you were in the Midwest.
I was.
In Nebraska.
I was.
And for my first 16 years, I was in South Dakota, living in Rapid City most some of that time. And then you went on to a school that I always wanted to go to, but would never have had the money to do it. But you went to Stanford, and that's very impressive to me.
Yeah.
Then you went to South America and taught, and but then you came back and you went to Columbia. So between Stanford and Columbia, you have my highest respect. At the same time, when you went to Stanford, my husband at that time and I lived in Menlo Park, well, what was called Sharon Heights in Palo Alto. And our houses were leased by the Stanford Lehman Farms. And we literally could see the cows on Lehman Stanford Farm.
Right.
Which always seemed funny to me.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's about as far as our correlations have gone. But
well, that's a lot of overlap.
I know it was.
Yeah.
So anyway, please tell your story.
Oh, that's lovely. Well, I am delighted that I spent my first 12 years living in a small farming community in Nebraska. It was just 40 miles north of Omaha, but unless you knew the area, no one's ever heard of it. One time I ran into someone who knew where Newman Grove was without my describing it. But I lived not on a farm, but in the community because my father was a businessman. And what I delight in is that during those 12 years living in Newman Grove, which had only a population of 1,000 people, we were just free to go wherever we went. And when I asked in later years my mother how come they never paid any attention to where we were, we'd leave the house in the morning and come back in the late afternoon. She said, well, everyone knew you and knew who you belonged to, so why would we worry? Anyway, in the summer, I could spend all day in the swimming pool, which I'm doing a replica of here. And in the winter, we could go sledding and have wonderful play in the snow. And none of that would have been possible if I had moved earlier to San Jose, California, where my parents moved. They took us there because San Jose State College, which is now part of the university, was there, and my father wanted his 5 children to be able to go to college. So of course, neither my older brother nor I went to San Jose State. But he got a full scholarship to Stanford through the Navy. And because he was my big brother and I loved my big brother, I wanted to go to Stanford and fortunately was able to earn a scholarship to go there. So I was delighted to be able to be at Stanford.
And your father was really beyond his time, wasn't he?
In what sense?
In wanting all of his children to have college educations.
Well,
And-
yes, maybe, but the reason that was so important to him was that he had gone to the University of Nebraska for 1 year, and the Depression hit, and he had to go home to work. And so he always felt cheated because he didn't get to finish his college education. He loved educating himself in every way and continued to do that, but never got to go back to college. So he was determined that his children have an opportunity. And I'm very grateful for that.
Well, my mom and dad came from very poor backgrounds, and my mother's brother they had enough money for one to go to college. And then the routine was that he was going to work and send my mom to college.
Yeah.
And then the Depression came and that wasn't possible. So I started college from the time I was 3 years old because my mom and dad were going to school all the time.
Oh.
And by the time I finished high school, my mom got her BA degree and my dad got his master's. And by the time I graduated from college, my mom had completed her master's.
Oh,
So
wonderful.
I
Wow.
went to school because my father was very clear, your only job is to go to school, go to school, go to school.
Oh.
So I finished a 2-year graduate program and was 21, but had no lived experience.
Oh my gosh.
So my real education came after I was educated, supposedly.
Right.
But,
I do understand that. Because right out of college, after my BA, by the way, my mother had a teacher's college certificate. She taught school for a few years, even during the Depression, though they were paid by what they called warrants or something, I've forgotten exactly, which meant they didn't get any money for teaching because it was during the Depression.
that's right.
Anyway, after college, I went directly to South America on a program through the Methodist Church, which was a part of all the mainline Protestant churches set up this program for people to go in what they called short-term mission. And actually the Peace Corps used that as their format when they organized and built on what the churches had put together. So we were sent directly out of college if we were going somewhere where a few months of language training would be helpful. They sent for language training, and then we went right to do whatever we had been prepared for in college. So I went to teach English they sent me to language school in Costa Rica for 4 months first. And I considered my main accomplishment in South America to be learning Spanish. I set the intention to be able to speak Spanish so that people could listen to what I was saying rather than how I was saying it.
Mhm.
By the time I returned home, I was on a plane that stopped over in Costa Rica. A man got on the plane and sat in the middle seat. I was on the window side, and we started talking in Spanish. And then a man got on to sit in the aisle seat, and he was obviously American. He had 2 cameras hanging around his neck and whatever. And he said, I said hello to him in English, and we just exchanged a few words. And the man in the middle spoke to me in Spanish and said, "Where did you learn to speak English so well?"
What a compliment, right?
That's the one. It was
Uh-huh.
like getting a graduate certificate. I told him that I was American. He said, "I don't believe it. I thought you were Argentine because your Spanish is flawless."
That's right.
That was my victory for,
And are you still fluent in
I
Spanish?
am still fluent and
Excellent.
I try to use it whenever I can.
Mhm.
I notice that the staff around here, when I speak Spanish to them, respond to me in English, almost as though they don't believe they just heard that in Spanish, you know? But I use it as often as I can. I love it, actually. Would be happy to have continued to speak Spanish for the rest of my life, but that didn't work out.
Yeah, I really had wanted our children to learn Spanish, and because we had 4 children in 5.5 years, they were like their own little
Wow.
nursery group.
Yeah.
And we had a wonderful woman who had raised 6 children
Mm.
who was Hispanic, and I asked for her to please speak Spanish to our children. Well, she had wonderful English, and she was so proud of it. She never would speak it, so the only time our children heard Spanish was when she would go to visit her mother, because only her mother spoke Spanish.
Yeah.
But I thought that was such a missed opportunity.
Yes,
Because
really.
I would love for them to have always known Spanish. And when we talk about, like, children today, they're having to go to school to learn English, that's a missed opportunity too.
Yes.
Because if we could teach both, so that the Spanish would
Exactly.
learn the English and the English could learn the Spanish, we would just be Americans, because we'd speak
That's right,
several
that's
languages.
right. I agree with you. I taught in a bilingual school down in Uruguay while I was there, and the children, the parents who sent their children there just treasured the opportunity for them to be learning in both English and Spanish, and it was a real opportunity for sure. But I was teaching in English, not in Spanish, and so I had to do my Spanish speaking outside of the classroom.
And when did you start dreaming in Spanish?
Well, I was about a little over than a year into living in Uruguay when I started to dream in Spanish and pray in Spanish and think in Spanish. And when I returned home, people could not believe that I was really saying what I was saying when I'd say I have to translate from Spanish, from English to Spanish and back again, because it was so confusing for me for several months after returning home. My younger brothers made fun of me because I would say, "Now what's the name of that?" meaning a salt shaker or whatever. I had really, everything had gone to the background, and I learning Spanish.
Well, our youngest daughter was very good at languages, and so she's an immigration judge today.
Wow.
But between her first and second year of law school, she went to the University of Madrid to
Oh,
learn her
wonderful.
Castilian Spanish.
Oh, lovely.
And she gets to use that in the court now, which is nice.
What a
And-
privilege.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
wonderful.
anyway, I'm glad you've kept it up.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And I really intended to go on, return to South America, so after I came back to the States, I went to Columbia. You mentioned Columbia, Teachers College at Columbia, to study English as a foreign language in order to be able to teach it in South America. And then I didn't go back. So instead I taught English here for a while and in San Jose, California, and then went into, I was hired at a large Methodist church to direct their children and youth programs. And so I kind of veered off the course of my Spanish speaking, but I've always used it as much as possible.
That's great.
Yeah.
And what about your life-threatening situation? Are you comfortable in talking about
Sure.
that?
Sure.
Because you've said your own survival was a marvel.
Yeah.
Let me have you give the background to that.
Well, one of the reasons I didn't, or the main reason I didn't return to South America was that while I was working at the Methodist Church, I met James Pike, who was bishop of the Episcopal Church in San Francisco. And after 2 years, we were married. And I jumped to that because shortly after our marriage, 9 months after our marriage to be precise, we were working on a book about the historical Jesus, and we planned a trip to Israel. And it turned out to be a very fateful trip. When we got there, Jim, as we got off the airplane, knelt down and kissed the ground and said, "I've come home." And I thought it was a bit bizarre. It was even more bizarre after what happened. I mean, it was almost as if subconsciously he sensed that he was never going to leave again. And I buried the body there because of his having kissed the ground and said, "I've come home." Anyway, we rented a car, gleefully decided to drive it out into the wilderness because we wanted to see if we could experience why all of the great leaders in Israel, the prophets and so forth, had gone out into the wilderness to fast and meditate for 40 days and 40 nights. And it was almost like an archetypal journey. So we wanted to have an experience to discover what that was about. Why did they do that? And of course, our primary interest being Jesus. So we had a little map that they had given us when we rented the car, and we followed the map and drove out into the wilderness. Well, we were so naive and so reckless. I use that word only in retrospect because it didn't feel that way when we were doing it, but the two of us were equally adventuresome. So we drove out on a road that turned out not to be a road intended for anyone to drive on, except for the Army when they went out there on some special occasion. And eventually came to a place where our car dropped into a big rut and we couldn't get it out. So we had to leave the car. It, by the way, was 105 degrees that day when we were out there. Very, very hot.
And humid.
No, dry, like here.
Okay.
The kind of dry we have in Arizona.
Okay.
So all of the soil that we drove on and walked on was hard, as if it was rock, but it's actually just dried clay.
Compacted.
Yeah, and dried out. So anyway, we had learned on a previous visit to Israel that the Army had done studies that showed that a person couldn't survive in the heat of the summer for more than, I think it was 4 hours without water. Well, we took 2 Coca-Colas with us. That was all we had. We didn't have any water. So I said, you know, we have to get out of here because we're going to die without water. And so we started walking and walked for a couple of hours. I don't know how, I've forgotten the details now. Feels like a past life recall, it's so long ago, 50 years ago now. Anyway, we walked and walked and walked, and finally Jim, who was 25 years older than I, said, I can't go any farther, I have to rest. And so we were lying down in a bit of shade that we found to rest, and I rested a few minutes and then said, oh, I think I need to go for help because we don't have any water. So I started out, and it took me 10 hours to climb along the cliffs and finally find a little road that they were in process of creating, and I walked as far as I could. Then I had sandals on, not prepared for a hike in the wilderness. And finally was so exhausted that I rolled to the bottom of a hill. And the whole way along I kept calling help, which was the instruction that Jim had given me when I left him. And I finally, when I rolled to the bottom of this hill, this road that was being created on a hillside, I was lying there and I said to myself, okay, one more time I'll call out, help me. And someone answered.
Oh my goodness.
I said, oh my God. So it was comical really, in that they could not, I learned later, they could not believe that a woman was coming out of the desert. So they thought it was a hyena or something.
May I interrupt you?
Yeah.
Can you still remember that feeling of hearing that voice?
Oh yeah. That was just unbelievable. And I thought, I said, help me, and they responded in probably Arabic, but I had no way of knowing what language, and so I tried Spanish and that didn't work. And finally they went to English, thank goodness. And I said, how can I get to where you are? And they said, use your feet. Oh. I was so exhausted and my feet were all torn up, and I thought, I don't know if I can get onto my feet, but I struggled to get up. And as I was doing that, a man came to help me. Because when he could see that I was really a human being, he decided it was okay to come and help me. They were so kind to me. Oh my God, they took care of me for 4 hours or something until the Israelis came. The Arabs were not allowed to leave their camp. They were there to do road work, and that was all. So we had to wait for the Israeli supervisor to come, and then he took me to the Israeli station, and they called and got the police and so forth. So the rest is history, except to say that when I went out with the police to search for Jim, I took them, because I remembered vividly where I had gone, and I took them exactly to where I'd left him, and he was no longer there. And then I showed them where I left and how I went down to the bottom of the canyon and so forth, and they said, you couldn't have done that. And I said, well, I did do that. And they said, no, you couldn't have. And so finally they said, well, you must be a Sabra, which is an Israeli woman, because they just couldn't believe it. Well, no one has been able to believe it. Even I, when I go back and read it, am hardly able to believe that I lived that. But I did, and I came out of it alive and was able to go with the searchers, and finally it was 4 or 5 days into the search when they found Jim's body. He had also gone to the bottom of the canyon, but he went a lot farther than I was able to go, and he had found water twice. But when he finally came to a place in the canyon where he couldn't go any farther at the bottom, he had to climb up, and while he was climbing up, he slipped on the loose rocks and fell about 30 feet and died there. So,
And were you alone during those 5 days of searching?
no, one of the great blessings that happened almost immediately was that a woman from the American consulate heard, I've forgotten how she heard about
Wow.
my situation, but she came to the hotel to ask me if there was anything she could do, and I said, yes, you could find me some shoes, because my sandals had torn, and
And what about
anyway,
your skin? Were you sunburned too?
oh, no, I was not sunburned so much as cut up, but I had gone, actually, because when I called home that night, my mother said, go see a doctor. Wouldn't you know? I'm 31 years old or whatever, and she, from thousands of miles away, says, go see a doctor. Okay, mother. And ask him to give you something to put you to sleep. Okay, I will. What a blessing. I felt so blessed to have my parents. Anyway.
Yes, a loving mom.
Yeah, she was wonderful. I was raised by two parents who were just wonderful, for which I'm very grateful. So when I talked to my parents, they knew that my brother Scott had traveled with Jim and me to Israel before, so they had the highway patrol find him on his excursion that he was on, and they flew him to Israel to be with me. So
wow, what a nice...
Yeah, he was with me till we flew back to the States, so that was a great blessing.
Yes, a fortunate happening in an unfortunate situation.
Yes, absolutely.
Wow. Do you ever dream of it today?
I do not. I do
so
not.
So it is really
it's
a past.
Really in the past, and
well, thank you for sharing that with us.
Sometimes I go back and read the story because I wrote it up in a book called Search,
yes,
which some of you have read because it's downstairs on the shelves. And I wrote that because when I told the story to Jim's friends, they said, you have to put this in writing, because he was a famous man and he thought people deserved to know what happened. So I wrote the book, and Doubleday published it, and so occasionally I go back and read it.
Did you write the book alone, or did you have some help?
Well, I wrote it alone, but my brother Scott edited and typed for me and so forth, so he was a big help. And
now in my world, you would have been called a very gutsy lady.
I was gutsy. Still am gutsy.
We had a lot of practice.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you very much for sharing.
Yeah, thank you. It, of course, was a remarkable and life imprinting experience. I never felt, people kept always saying to me, what a tragedy. I could never feel that. Somehow, the whole thing, even while I was living it, felt like it was what was intended to be. And so I never felt it was a tragedy.
Yeah. What other things would you like to share about your life?
Well, a couple of years after Jim died, I met Arlene Lawrence, and
who is also here.
And we began a work together, which we continue to do to this day. We had a little nonprofit corporation that handled the business side of it, and we traveled during the first 20 years or so. We traveled all over the United States and in Canada on weekends doing weekend workshops. And we also did longer workshops that were two weeks. We started doing that sometime into our work. We originally, being the naive persons we were, we thought all people needed was to be introduced to the 6 love principles, and that they would then be able to go out and transform their own lives because these principles are so powerful. Well,
And would you like to share those principles?
I would like to
Okay,
share them,
good.
and I should have brought a little yellow card, because if anyone's really interested, we can give them a yellow card that has the principles on it. But the primary focus of these principles is opening the heart center. And before I met Arlene, I had had experiences of energetic openings, and so when she shared these principles with me, I felt like I already knew them, and they just were entirely in harmony with my own development, spiritual development. So I will take a little sip here.
And how would you schedule your workshops?
All by word of mouth. In fact, we never intended, both of us were trained teachers. So we started by going around to schools and graduate schools and junior colleges saying, how would you like us to come and teach these 6 principles? And no one took us up on it. We went to the military. They were not interested. And then one day a woman called on the phone and said, would you be willing to come to my home if I invite a few of my friends and talk to us in my home? We said, sure. Well, that turned out to be the format for how we did our work from then on. It was just amazing. It just unfolded all by word of mouth.
Which is the best referral you can have.
Yeah, we never advertised. One person would, you know, if you had us to your home for a session, you would tell your friends and they would tell their friends. And so we traveled all over the United States and in Canada that way. We got to Canada because in Chicago one time we were doing a workshop, and a woman was there from Canada, and she said, will you come up to Toronto if we invite you? Of course. So anyway, that's how everything unfolded for all these years. That's how we've worked. It's remarkable.
Did you ever see yourself as a nomad?
Actually, I had developed, before I met Arlene, a parallel process of the Israelites making their way out of Egypt through the desert to Israel, and the process that was going on for so many young people in our culture at that time, which I called the urban nomad. So I actually had developed the parallel and wrote a little pamphlet about it. But yes, I saw myself as a nomad, and I thought we were all making our way to something really new. And I hope this isn't it, what we're living right now.
I like that word, urban.
Urban nomad.
Yes.
Nomad, yeah. The principles focus on, as I said, on opening the heart center. So the most difficult principle for most people is the one that corresponds to the heart center that says, receive all people as beautiful, exactly as they are. And people say to us, well, I can't do that because I don't like so-and-so, or I don't approve of so-and-so, or whatever. And so we came to see that the only way you would ever work with this principle is if you wanted to. If you wanted to open the heart center. Because the heart center is very powerful energy that requires just getting out of the way. And I like to say it's like having the sun shining in your chest. It beams out to everyone. There's no filter, there's no decision making about who shall I love. And I worked with that principal for about 10 years before I got to the point where I felt it was natural. And my test came, are we getting close to the end here? No.
Are we?
It's up to you, if you
We
want to go a little
we can
longer.
go.
Okay. I was walking on the street, I don't even remember where in, let's call it Chicago, some city where we were giving a workshop. And this man walks right up to me in his grubby, I'm sure he was living on the street, grubby clothes. He looked like he hadn't bathed in forever, and his hair was all tousled and so forth. And he came up to me and he said, "Will you give me a hug?" I felt like the universe was saying, "Are you for real or not?" So I took a deep breath and I said, "Yes, I will." And I gave him a big hug. And he said, "Thank you," and walked on. Now, is that a test from the universe or what?
That's right, that's right.
Anyway, that's, for me, the central principle. Most people find it easier to start with the others. One of them is create your own reality consciously. Another is provide others with opportunities to give. Another is have no expectations, but rather abundant expectancy. That's a hard one, to have no expectations, but.
Well,
And
not having expectations is an expectation.
well, almost, yeah, right. And the other one is problems are opportunities. So when we did workshops and do workshops, we work with those principles, having people actually practice them with one another. So we always called our workshops practice sessions,
Excellent.
because we hoped that people would actually learn the skill of being unconditionally loving while they were working with us. And so people then began to say, but we need more. And that's why we started developing longer sessions. And first we did 2 weeks, week-long sessions, then 2 weeks, and then also developed a program called the Theater of Life. And I developed something called Life as a Waking Dream. And this was my program was to help people to hopefully wake up to their life and how they are living it. Because when you realize that life is a dream, then everything in it becomes a symbol of something in you, and you begin to see, if I have a negative response to something, what is it in me that is being reflected there that I need to take a look at? So I eventually wrote it up as a book, which is also an example, is on the shelf down there. But it really is something you need to do actively. Because if you don't work with the symbols and see how you're creating what you're creating, it doesn't really take you anywhere.
Well, you're reminding me, I was very fortunate to have had extremely good mentors and instructors and so on. And my first year in graduate school, my 2 years of graduate school, my first year, my supervisor was known to counsel out half of her supervisees. So there were 12 of us, and by half the year there were 6 of us left. But she was so good, she was so good. And I was very naive, very young, and in the beginning of graduate school, I was in Minneapolis, there was a headline: the father had chopped off the hands of his daughter.
Oh my God.
I couldn't imagine somebody being so cruel, so ugly, so everything. And I emoted that to my advisor, Rita Rappaport. And she had published a lot and so on. Anyway, she listened to me, and then we toured the county hospital. And here was this little girl, she was about 4, curly hairs, and she had little stubs. And it just haunted me for the weekend. And it was really, really hard. Well, that spring, she gave me a file, and she said, "Sharon, read this file, and you have an appointment with this man at 1 o'clock. Well, I read the file, and I could not believe it. There was no way I was trained to meet that person because the abuse he had had and just, it was unbelievable. And I thought, well, should I be honest with her or should I pretend as if I can do this? And I thought, no, I need to be honest. So I went, and those were the days when she would be behind the desk and
Oh,
we were
yeah,
in front of the
right.
desk. And I said, Dr. Rappaport, I'm really sorry, but I'm not qualified to see this man.
Mm.
And she got up on her desk and sat on it and looked down at me and said, you're not seeing him, but that's the father that you were so upset with. That was such a learning experience for
wow.
me.
Wow.
So it still gives me shivers to think about it because I learned there's always a story behind another story.
Right, exactly
And
right.
never
Yeah,
suspend judgment.
yeah,
And
right.
that's a hard thing to do because we like to close down and judge, but stay curious and,
And listen to the person.
yes, and
if you-
listen.
Yeah,
Right, right. Well, thank you so much for many, many good stories and experiences. And I
Well,
so
thank you,
appreciated your sharing your time with us. Thank you very, very much.
thank you very much, Sharon.